In this lecture, we continue the stories of Abraham and Sarah, Isaac and Rebekah, the theme being threats to the promise, the way those threats are overcome, and perhaps fulfilled. There is a pattern sort of interwoven in the stories of Abraham and Isaac, Sarah and Rebekah. There's a pattern of promise, threat to the promise, threat overcome, partial fulfillment, and sometimes fulfillment. The promises have been made, but how will they be fulfilled? Abram and Sarai are childless, they are wanderers in the land, and there is the constant threat of strife with other inhabitants of the land. Immediately after the promises are given, in 12:1 through 9, Abram and Sarai go to Egypt, and Sarai is presented as Abram's sister, lest Abram, the chief of the tribe, be killed because of Sarai. But as a consequence, she is taken by Pharaoh. This is sort of the theme of threat to the mother. Because if Sarai is in Pharaoh's court, potentially she might have children, and they would not be descendants of Abram. That threat is overcome as the Lord afflicts Pharaoh by bringing plagues, and Sarai is freed. At this point, the promise of land and offspring is repeated in Genesis 13. But just before that promise is reiterated, there is another threat, and that is the strife with Lot. So it's a threat to that theme of blessing. The threat is overcome by a division of land access between Abram and Lot, and the promise of land and offspring is repeated. So there are two threats, two conflicts having to do with descendants, with land, with blessing. And once those threats are overcome, the promise is repeated. But immediately there is another threat as Lot is carried off by warring kings. Again, a threat to the blessing. The threat is overcome when Lot is rescued by Abram. And at that point there is a blessing of Abram by Melchizedek. So blessing is again spoken and brought back to the forefront. But in regard to descendants, Abram is childless, and his heir will be a servant, Eliezer. And at this point, a promise of land and offspring is repeated. Partial fulfillment comes with the birth of Ishmael. Ishmael is a descendant of Abram. It is not the one intended, but it is a partial fulfillment. It's also a complicating fulfillment. After the birth of Isaac, there is a specific promise made of the birth of Isaac, but a place is also given to Ishmael, and there is a promise of land, and an added promise, that of God's presence. And there is partial fulfillment in the prediction of pregnancy for Sarah, and Abraham is a blessing to Lot and his family. The mother is again threatened in that when Abraham and Sarah are in Gerar, Sarah again is presented as Abraham's sister, and she is taken by Abimelech. So this also puts into question who will be the descendant of Abraham if Sarah is taken away. That threat is overcome in that the Lord comes to Abimelech in a dream and Sarah is released. Partial fulfillment comes in that peace is made between Abraham and Abimelech. So again, moving forward with the theme of blessing. The fulfillment regarding descendants is initially then fulfilled in the birth of Isaac. Ishmael is sent away, but the Lord promises to make a nation of him as well. The greatest threat comes with the binding of Isaac, where Abraham is told to sacrifice Isaac. That threat is overcome when the angel of the Lord, or the Lord, both are sort of mentioned alternately in the passage, prevents the sacrifice. And again, the promise of offspring, land, and blessing is given. Partial fulfillment of the land occurs when property is sold to Abraham by the Hittites to serve as a burial place for Sarah. Then the story moves on to Isaac, and the promise continues. But Rebekah is barren, so you have another question. Will the promise be fulfilled? The threat is overcome as the Lord answers Isaac's prayer and Rebekah becomes pregnant. And there is again a fulfillment in the birth of Jacob and Esau. But then another threat arises, the strife between Jacob and Esau. That threat is not overcome till many, many, many chapters and many, many, many years later. But Isaac is again given the promise of land, descendants, and blessing. There is another threat again to the mother. When Isaac and Rebekah are in Gerar, Rebekah is presented as Isaac's sister. This raises the possibility that Rebekah will be taken. However, this threat is averted when Abimelech finds out that Rebekah is Isaac's wife. A partial fulfillment regarding the land takes place as Isaac plants crops in Gerar, and so has increased use of the land. However, that again is threatened by a dispute with the Philistines over possession and wells, access to water. That threat is overcome as Isaac moves to another place. And again, the promise is reiterated. And there is partial fulfillment in that Isaac makes peace and is called a blessing. So throughout these chapters from 12 through 26, there is the constant question, will the promise be fulfilled? The promise of offspring is continually threatened, but by God's action begins to be fulfilled. In regard to land, at this point, only small moves are made in regard to the promise of the land. The ownership of a field and a tomb, and the ability to plant crops by Isaac. And again, the blessing, the idea that Abraham and his descendants will be a blessing to the nations, is also threatened by various kinds of strife, war, disagreement, alienation, and yet there are also actions which resolve those acts of strife, and peace is made with the inhabitants of the land.